Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Good evening. I wish to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me here this evening. These include the organizers of the Veritas Forum, the University of Toronto Secular Alliance, RZIM Canada, Nick Hill, and all of the other volunteers at Power to Change at the University of Toronto. John and I and some of my family members, we just came from dinner, and John said it was okay if I go over 20 minutes, just a hair. So I'm going to try to get this thing done as quickly as possible, so don't start flagging me and, waving me down and whatnot. So tonight, we're here to discuss the topic, has science made God irrelevant? Now, although I would have been happy, and I discussed this with John, I would have been happy to have argued either side. I've been given the task of arguing in the affirmative, and I do think at some point in the future, during one of these events, I'd like to take the Christian perspective, and I want the Christian to take the atheistic perspective. Wouldn't that be interesting? Just for kicks, just to do that, to see how good of a job can you do on the other side. But that's not happening tonight. So, in the spirit of my training in analytic philosophy, I'm going to start with some conceptual clarity. And if we're talking about has science made God irrelevant, then we need to know what we're talking about in terms of science, what we mean by God, and what we mean by irrelevance. So, I'm just giving you a functional, operational definition of science. It's an intellectual and practical method for systematically understanding cause and effect relationships of structure and behavior in the natural world. The word science comes from the Latin scire, or scientia, which means to know or knowledge. So it is a manner of knowing or understanding the causes of effects through empirical observations, experimentation, and rational deductions. Science encompasses many fields of inquiry, and these range from earth and space science, social sciences, life sciences, physical sciences, and even the formal sciences of mathematics and logic. In terms of scientific methodology, there might not be one specific scientific method, but there are commonalities in scientific methods, requiring people to postulate hypotheses, make predictions, conduct experiments, acquire data, and then to draw reasonable conclusions regarding the manner to which the data supports or fails to support the predictions, thereby falsifying or supporting the hypotheses. Now, in terms of God, tonight we are not discussing whether or not science has made, say, Zeus irrelevant, right? Today we have a much better understanding of what causes lightning. Although the supposed existence of Zeus mattered greatly to Greek populations thousands of years ago, he, along with Apollo and Artemis, Poseidon, and all the others, have fallen quite out of favor these days. You can still get shirts with "What would Zeus do," though. Now, the same is true for other gods, Odin, Thor, and all the others in Norse mythology. So too for Mercury, Bacchus, Neptune, and all the rest in Norman mythology, which is too bad because they could have really livened up a few kegger parties if they had been around. But then we'd have to live with the hangover of a bunch of petty, jealous, and stupid gods fighting each other over passions and desires, which are all too human. And they wouldn't leave the party. So, when we ask about whether or not science has made God irrelevant, let us be clear and to the point. Tonight, we are referring to a very specific God. We're referring to the God of Christianity. Although this narrows our focus more sharply, it could also create a whole new set of problems, for it raises questions about whose interpretation of this particular God should we accept and why. Be that as it may, my focus, and I believe John's as well, will be narrowly directed towards an Abrahamic depiction of a triune God, as described in both the Old and New Testaments. Now, in terms of relevance, the basic standard dictionary definition, not having a bearing, connection, or relation to the matter at hand. And what's the matter at hand this evening? Well, it's understanding causality, or cause and effect relationships. So, the topic, has science made God irrelevant, can be translated to mean the following. Has the systematic understanding of cause and effect relationships of structure and behavior in the natural world made the biblical God of the Old and New Testaments without bearing, connection, or relation to our understanding of causality? Based on this clarification of tonight's topic, the answer clearly and unequivocally is yes. But you can rightly say, how so? Okay. To demonstrate this, we need to understand the history of where we came from. We need to understand human evolution, both biological and cultural. And we need to understand the ways in which our species evolved to understand cause and effect relationships. Now, I will put forward the disclaimer, what I call no proposition without presupposition. To be sure, in order for me to present my case, there will be unavoidable presuppositions and assumptions on my part, not the least of which will be my reliance on logic, both formal and informal, empirical observation, evidence-based reasoning, and the various methods and means used by the various sciences outlined before. If you demand of me indubitable certainty of my reasoning, you will not find it here tonight, or perhaps any night. Neither I nor anyone else here tonight or residing on this planet that I know of can do this. What I will provide instead are reasonable, practical, and pragmatic accounts taken from reliable and epistemically responsible sources. So, let us look at a brief history of humanity's attempts to understand causality. When we look at the immense amount of evidence regarding human evolution, both biological and cultural, we find stages of development from more primitive cultures to more advanced cultures over periods of millions of years. What we call the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, or the EEA, is a period of human evolution going back from about 7 million years ago to about 10,000 years ago. My interest is mostly with this period known as the Upper Paleolithic. A lot happened with our species between 70,000 and 10,000 years ago. Even though we had been evolving from a common ancestor of the chimpanzee for over 6 million years, that's where a lot of the action took place for humans. Now here's basically a timeline of African apes. You can see a split between common ancestral primates, and the lemurs go their way, and then the tarsiers, and then everyone else basically splits off from the New World monkeys to the Old World monkeys to gibbons to orangutans, gorillas, and then there's us and chimps splitting at about 6 to 7 million years ago. The chimps went their way, and we went our way. And here is what is currently known, I'm sorry because of the lighting you can't see it very well, but we go back to the Australopithecines, Afarensis and a number of others, or Gaster, and we get into the Homo genus here with, essentially habilis and erectus, heidelbergensis, Neanderthalis, and then humans like us, sapiens. When we look at physical features, just our brain sizes alone, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but our ancestors had fairly small brains, 450 cubic centimeters. We're now sitting at around 1,350 cubic centimeters. So in a period of a few million years, our brain sizes got larger and larger and larger. But notice all of these other humans here. They're all dead. They're all extinct. Homo sapiens, we got lucky. Neanderthals died out about 30,000 years ago. Same with Florenziensis or Erectus. They're all gone. It's just us. We have these big brains. We don't have sharp claws and super sharp teeth. We don't have great camouflage or speed. The average rabbit can outrun Usain Bolt, right? So we put all of our energies into getting this really creative 3 pounds of electric meat inside of our heads. Very expensive organ. 20% of our body's energy used to supply this particular organ. It's my second favorite organ. So. I like the pancreas. What are you guys thinking about? This is a church, people. Let's keep it clean, shall we? Notice our dentition. You ever look in the mirror when you're brushing your teeth? Why do your teeth look so different? Why do you have some for chewing and tearing and biting and grinding? Why wouldn't we just have like cow teeth? The reason is because we were omnivores. We ate everything. If it moved, we ate it. Everything. Meat, tubers, nuts, berries, and lots of insects. By the way, prediction, put your money into insects because it's going to become a major food source in the next 20 years. You watch. Now, what happened was our ancestors, the Australopithecines, Lucy, their guts, when we were up in the trees, were much larger because we had to digest enormous amounts of plants and get protein from plant foods. Once we come down from the trees, become bipedal, stand upright, start to move around through Africa, Spoiler alert, we are all African. Every one of us came from Africa. We are all descended from the same basic ancestors of Africa. We move around. Our guts don't need to be as long. We're eating meat. Meat provides enormous amounts of protein and was responsible largely for the increase, or what's known as encephalization, of our brains. Now, there were other factors going on as well. The physiological development of the larynx, Philip Lieberman, Dan Lieberman's father, he did amazing work in this area. What he saw, the difference between us and other primates, is that at the age of 2, our larynx drops in our throat. We can no longer do circular breathing. That's why kids can't breastfeed without choking after about the age of 2. That's why you can't drink a glass of water and breathe in deeply. Don't try it. You know what's going to happen. It's because your larynx dropped by the age of 2. This facilitated greater space in our throats, which helped greatly in the articulation and enunciation of sounds, language. You ever wonder why you can't shut kids up at 2? It's because they now have the basic facilities in which to create speech, right? So, we speciated Homo sapiens about 200,000 years ago. Something very important to consider, the fields that I'm most interested in, is the emergence, the coevolution of language and consciousness. The more our ancestors became consciously aware of their environment, the more they developed languages in which to discuss that environment. The greater their language capacity, the greater they could become conscious of what was going on. And this created a cycling feedback loop, a coevolution, as you were. And a lot of this happened in the last 70,000 years. There were relevant neurobiological factors as well. We have plenty of neurotransmitters in our brains. They're not there by sheer whimsy that we decided someday we were going to eat a plant in order to try to get more of a neurotransmitter. They evolve that way because they give us a feedback to do certain things, like eat and have sex and that kind of thing. Our neurotransmitters get us to do certain things. Our brains get us to do certain things. Now, in the EEA, we see by the middle to upper Paleolithic periods, our ancestors were pretty much the same as we are now. They were shorter, but same brain size, same physiology, same dentition, everything was the same. Records indicate that our ancestors were leaving Africa between 60 and 100,000 years ago, following coastlines and populating the rest of the world, including the Americas. They had advanced stoneworking technology, they had sophisticated tools, art carvings, engravings, cave paintings, burial rituals. A lot of this was happening, and sophisticated hunting and fishing techniques, and a representation of symbolic thought. This all in the last 70,000 years. For 4, 5, 6 million years, basically a simple stone axe would suffice for almost 1 million years. Then all of a sudden, the complexity of culture starts to go right off the scale. Now, there was something known as a cultural explosion, where this rapid increase starts to compound and collect and get bigger and bigger and bigger. And in the artifact records, we see intentionality, symbolic representation in manipulating materials, and language and consciousness are largely responsible for this. Because you need the language, you need the consciousness in order to have the intentionality to bring these types of things around. With an increase in consciousness and language came greater capacities to try to understand cause and effect relationships in the world. But without a mature understanding of how the natural world functions, you get gaps, and these would appear in how our ancestors tried to explain the world. Now here's something I call the volcano island example. So to illustrate this, just imagine a tribe on a volcanic island in the South Pacific somewhere, hundreds of years ago. And they're living in a place that's very dangerous. The mountain is spewing forth all kinds of lava and whatnot, and it's extremely dangerous, hostile place to live. But this power is so much bigger than them, they can't simply turn it off. They have to figure a way in which to stop whatever is going on in that mountain from killing them, because they personalize everything. Now that they have consciousness and language, they know what things are good and bad. They develop value systems for the first time in our human ancestral history. And they know that mountain can kill them. Attributing agency to the mountain might seem a little unusual to us, some of us today, but to them, without a complete science, a more developed science, it would make perfect sense to attribute agency to the mountain and then to try to do something to stop that mountain from killing you. So the old cliche of throw something valuable into the mountain. Well, what do we value? Virgins. Chuck a virgin into the mountain. If it seems to have appeased the mountain god, then correlation equals causation. If it doesn't appease it, might be a bad day for virgins, right? Get another one, right? So show me a Pacific island with an active volcano, I'll show you a group with a lot of nervous virgins, right? Which might lead to increased promiscuity. You don't know, right? You never know with these things. But the fact of the matter is, they don't have a fully developed science. They don't know anything about plate tectonics, seismology, pressures from under the earth, magma flows, lava, eruptions, pressurized gas. They don't know anything about that. And listen, when I was camping in Algonquin Park a few years ago, shortly after the ice went off on the lakes, deep into the park, it rained for 5 straight days and nights. Any of you folks are campers, you know how bad that is. You would rather have snow than rain any day. For 5 days, it hardly let up at all. The guy I was with, big, strong, tough guy, yeah, he was reduced to jello. He just couldn't stand it. By the night of the 5th day, the clouds open up. We start to see the sun. He turns into a giddy idiot. He's just giggling. And then it occurred to me why people could attribute agency to natural events. We were very grateful that that sun came out, but we couldn't control it ourselves. It was beyond our control, but we were grateful. And so I could understand the attribution of agency to natural events. It made sense to me. Now, these people on these volcanic islands, I don't blame them, right, for attributing supernatural agency or being epistemically irresponsible, because their worldviews were framed. They were constrained and limited by what's called their facticity. They could not have known about the natural forces at work any more than Aristotle could have known about downloading information off the internet. And I do get it, how agency can be attributed. Now, in terms of our ancestral lives, there would have been lots of things that left gaps in their explanatory schemas, and they wanted to fill them in with various things. And, they had to avoid predators and avoid food scarcity and all this kind of thing. And when you fill those gaps in, chuck a virgin into the volcano, chant a particular prayer, whatever it is that they believed in, it triggers certain types of neurochemical responses. If you're stressed out and you got a ton of cortisol in your mouth, and we measure that, and then we put you in a situation where you believe something has been fulfilled in a particular way, and that satiates, that fills that gap in, your cortisol is reduced, the endorphins come out, the enkephalins come out, and you get a little high. And your brain does that to you every day, all the time. You do what you do because you get high. If you're religious, you do it because it gets you high. If you're an atheist, you disbelieve because it gets you high. That is how our brains have evolved. What happened eventually is we developed agriculture about 11,000 years ago in 4 different parts in the world. And this changed the world forever. In fact, if this didn't happen, we're not here tonight. No longer do we have to be nomadic, moving around, finding various types of animals and plants. We can bring them to us and raise them, live next to fresh water, and then people can start to specialize in various types of tool building and security and all kinds of different factors and whatnot. More sophisticated belief systems are going to develop because there's time for that. You don't have to keep worrying about predation and certain things. As more beliefs develop, they become categorized and distinguished into what we could call the sacred and the secular. And then what we see in human evolution within the last 5,000 to 6,000 years or so is we see world religions developing, and a lot of them, right? So we see ancient Greece and ancient Rome here, Judaism, forms of Hinduism, Christianity coming along here, the various different groups of Christianity factioning off and whatnot. So lots and lots and lots and lots of world religions start to develop. For millennia, world religions have and continue to influence the ways in which people live their lives. So we get things like customs and rituals and beliefs, even wars. These influence people and how they live their lives according to how they answer questions of causality. And what happened was, as we start to move through the Dark Ages, we see a gradual trend returning back to kind of secularism. By the end of the Dark Ages, you're starting to see secularism on the rise. We see that in the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. We find the Copernican revolution. We see Galileo basically stating that we no longer have to believe in a biblical account of a geocentric planetary model. We have the Copernican heliocentric model. It works much better because that is the way the world is, even if it goes against what certain religious views happen to maintain. We see separation of church and state. Secular laws begin to develop to govern irrespective of religious affiliation. And then in the 19th century comes along Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin. And certainly the world has never been the same since. Darwin, for the first time in history, gives us a very, very good account of how we all got here, what causality is all about in terms of human endeavor and struggle, without the need for any particular God. We have been selected, luckily enough, we have been selected by nature to survive. And boy, were we lucky, a lot of things could have led to our not being here tonight. And Darwin was the one who took it upon himself and created a very systematic understanding of natural selection and how humans, like any other species, are a part of the natural, not supernatural, order of things. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the increase continues. Continued understanding of matter and energy, genetics develops, and many forms of technologies. Now, to conclude, I'd like you to think about the history of our species for a moment. For the majority of our existence and the existence of our ancestors, there was no religion, there were no gods, no supernatural forces, and no miracles. And then, quite recently, when the perfect storm of causes came together, including bipedalism, larger brains, smaller guts, changes in diet, gene regulation, the developments of flora and fauna, consciousness and language, they came together to produce ancestors who asked more questions about causes in their world. And when they did, at first they developed mythologies, and then they developed religions, and now we have science. Agency was attributed to the sky, the water, the land, the mountains, the forest, the sun, the darkness. Soon after this, more organized religions developed, first polytheistic and then monotheistic. And then quite recently, our very creative and imaginative ancestors figured out a lot more about causality. And they realized that there was no longer any need to attribute unseen forces of agency to these causes. These causes were perfectly natural. And humans, not gods, nor angels, nor saints, nor demons, nor any other man-made tales of imagination were required. I am truly sorry if members of the audience find this to be cold and impersonal. But science is not in the business of making us feel better at the risk of our wishes and desires. It is in the business of describing the way the universe functions without our moral approval or condemnation. In this way, science is a neutral tool that simply functions to provide probabilistic, accurate descriptions of cause and effect relationships in the natural world. And the technological advances that come from science are not miracles. They are simply facts that result from the imagination and creative insights that allow the blind to see, the deaf to hear, the crippled to walk, the amputees to have functioning limbs, and even the dead to live again. In such ways, we can see how the fields of science have developed over hundreds of years to a point where there is simply no need to inject any irrelevant agency into our understanding of natural causes of the universe. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. John Lennox.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is 52 years since I last saw this church, and that makes me tremble with age. And we're addressing the question, has science made God irrelevant? Irrelevant to what? Is it irrelevant to the question as to whether the Maple Leafs are going to win next season? The Latin word relevare means to lift up, and so to count as important. And it is my pleasure tonight to be invited by several groups here that you've heard them listed, and by particular honor to be able to have a worthy disputation partner in Dr. DiCarlo. He has defined for us, and saved me a lot of time actually, in running through some of the basic ideas behind the sciences, and he has narrowed the discussion to the question of the nature of cause-effect relationships. But I notice, following his logic, that all the time he's talking about cause-effect relationships within nature. So he's left unanswered the major question of why there is a nature at all, why there is a nature to be studied. After all, if God hadn't put the universe there, there wouldn't be any biology, physics, or chemistry, or anything else. And it seems to me one of the major areas where, far from science making God irrelevant, it is God that makes science possible. We easily forget the history of science. You've noticed the quotations mentioning Galileo and Copernicus. They were all believers in God. And in the 16th and 17th centuries, modern science exploded in Western Europe. And most historians of science agree that that was because of the influence of Christianity. C.S. Lewis put it brilliantly when he said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. So here am I as a scientist and a Christian, and not remotely embarrassed by it because Christianity arguably gave me my subject. And the reason, of course, that Christianity drove the rise of science was that one of its basic doctrines, stated at the very beginning of the Bible, is that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So, of course, the prior question to all of these considerations we've just heard is, why is there something rather than nothing? And that is a question, of course, that interests physicists enormously. And the fun is, to my mind, that for centuries, Aristotle dominated. And so scientists, if you could call them that, believed in an eternal universe until the 1960s. And I was alive then, not the 1860s, the 1960s. When I was in Cambridge, and the evidence for what we now call the Standard Model, a hot Big Bang, came in. And what many of you will not know is that it was hotly resisted by the scientific establishment in the United Kingdom. We must not allow the idea or admit it that the universe or space-time had a beginning. Why? Because it'll give too much leverage to those who believe the Bible. Now, that's so interesting that it was a resistance in the name of science against something the Bible had been saying for centuries. So that's not bad. So my first point is that modern science is the gift of Christianity. And yet we've heard modern science used in a way to criticize the existence of God, which I find quite curious, I must say. Perhaps that's why Dr. DiCarlo is quite happy to go on the other side as well. He's not so convinced of the truth of his arguments. But there we are. We shall see when we come into the time of discussion what is going to happen. But I think I need to say a little bit more about cosmology, because why there is something rather than nothing is a huge question today. Because the Standard Model says that space-time had a beginning. So what does the universe come from? Now, as a Christian, I have an answer to that question. It comes from God, who's not nothing, but he's not physical. God is spirit. That's the first point. The second point is that if you abolish the transcendent God and try to get a universe from nothing, you get into some very sticky messes. Let me quote for you Stephen Hawking's argument to get rid of God. The center of his book, The Grand Design, is like this: because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. And when I first read that, I thought, come again? Because there is a law of gravity, because there's something, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Flat contradiction number one. Secondly, because there is a law of gravity. It doesn't say because gravity exists. And what a law of gravity could mean, if there's no gravity, it beggars the imagination. But it opens the lid on a common philosophical confusion among my scientific colleagues. They think that laws are creative. Some people in high financial mathematics thought that too. They thought mathematics could create money. Do you remember that? It caused the banking crisis. It's called creative accounting. And of course, that's not true. Lewis pointed out long ago, add 1 and 1, you get 2. But that'll never put $2 in your pocket. And I had a little discussion with Peter Atkins, one of the most famous atheists around from Oxford, a brilliant chemist. I said, what created the universe, Peter? Oh, he said mathematics. And I hadn't met him before, and I'm afraid I was rather rude. I started to laugh. And he said, what are you laughing at? Well, I said, that's the most foolish thing I've ever heard in my life. I am a mathematician, and Peter, let me make it simple for you. 1 + 1 = 2. Did that ever put £2 in your pocket? That is a confusion of thought. The laws are descriptions with great predictive power. They're marvelous. I love explaining them to people. But they are not creative. So what is creative? Well, let's go on with Hawking, because he's one of the leading scientific figures in the world. I remember him at Cambridge. He was just before me, chronologically, and he's light years ahead of me in his mathematical brain power. But when it comes to philosophy, I'm a bit concerned. I really am a bit concerned. The universe can create itself from nothing. How's that for an explanation? The universe can create itself. If I say to you, X creates Y, what does that mean? Well, roughly, if you've got X, you get Y. If I say X creates X, what does that mean? Well, if you've got X, you get X. What does that mean? It means that nonsense remains nonsense, even if high-powered scientists write it. This is absurdity, ladies and gentlemen. Even more absurd is Lawrence Krauss, world-famous astrophysicist. Page 3 or 4 of his book, he says, because something is physical, nothing must be physical, especially if you define it as the absence of something. What? Now, I'm just pointing out the absurdity to which people are going to avoid the God question. They're not answering the question. And in fact, in desperation, they've now redefined nothing. There's much ado about nothing out there, you know. But I had the opportunity to debate this with Alan Guth, the father of inflation, brilliant astrophysicist. And I said, Alan, look, we're all confused about nothing. Tell us, please, when you use nothing as a physicist, you're not talking about philosophical nothing. No, he says, we certainly aren't. I thanked him very much. They haven't solved the problem, ladies and gentlemen. It still stands as strong as ever. The simple answer, of course, I believe to be the right one. God caused it to be. And that is why it does exist. Now, there are many avenues on which we could go, but I was fascinated at the emphasis in causality, and yet the major steps in all of this scheme we've just seen were not explained. It was simply a descriptor of history. Consciousness arose and so on. But any mechanisms, any evidence that this happened without God at any level at all, I didn't see. I may have missed something, but I didn't see it. Because, of course, it's one thing to give scientific mechanisms by which things happen. It's another thing to, well, the problem is that explanation comes in more than one form, doesn't it? When Isaac Newton discovered the law of gravity, upon which much of this stuff depends, he didn't say, I've got gravity, I don't need God. No, he wrote the Principia Mathematica and said, what a marvelous God who did it that way. That is, the more he understood of science, the more he worshipped the God who did it that way because, and I was so glad to hear Dr. DiCarlo say so, dismissing the gods of the gaps like the Greeks. Isaac Newton didn't believe God was a God just of the bits of the universe we don't understand, but God of the whole show, and that's important. One of the big confusions in the modern debate is this Stephen Hawking idea. He's the most prominent now. You must choose between God and science. And the reason he says that is firstly because he's confused about God. He thinks God is a placeholder, an X, who explains what science has not yet explained. And therefore, of course, he's forced to choose between science and God because that's the way he's defined God. And of course, Genesis, as you may have observed, does not begin with the statement, in the beginning God created the bits of the universe we don't understand. He created the whole show. That's the first important thing in the nature of explanation. The second important thing is to realize that scientific descriptions are only one-level descriptions. Why is the water boiling? Well, because heat's been conducted from a flame through the base of a copper kettle. It's agitating the molecules of water. They're moving faster and faster and so on. That's why it's boiling. No, it isn't. I want a cup of tea. That's why it's boiling. Now, I'm glad you laugh, because you see the different levels of explanation. They do not conflict. They do not compete. But the crucial thing is this. Translating that back into science, the existence of a mechanism that does something is not evidence for the non-existence of an agent who designed it. And of course, the question is, does it bear marks of design, which was a question that Dr. DiCarlo raised through his talks. Now, I'm going to cut this right down to the quick, because it seems to me that one of the major evidences that this is a word, an intelligence-based universe, and that bottom-up causal explanations are inadequate. You see, if you take strict cause-effect, this is something from which all Irishmen suffer, as I'll explain to you in a moment. People say to me, you say that because you're an Irishman. You notice what that means. Therefore, what you say is without meaning. Now, isn't that interesting? You give a causal explanation for a statement to empty it of meaning. And if you could give a cause-effect relationship going right back to physics and chemistry, what you do is empty the universe of meaning. You see, at the very beginning, God is irrelevant to what cause-effect relationship, but half a minute. There's a lot more to the universe than cause-effect relationships. There's a question of significance, meaning, love, aesthetics, all of that. Is God irrelevant to those? Well, I believe he's not irrelevant to science, but those other things, they are huge things. And this is one of the major problems with reductionism. And I must stress this because it has become common to believe that all explanation is bottom-up. The whole universe is explicable, as the ancient atomists believed, in terms, as they put it, of atoms in the empty space. So it's cause and effect from bottom up because there's no top. There's no ultimate top-down causation. And that works quite well in certain circumstances. And of course, I am, by nature, a methodological reductionist. I split big problems into little ones. Even in my own family, I do that, to try and solve the little ones and get insight on the big ones. But of course, if there is no transcendence, if there's no God, then we're forced into the narrowness of what is called ontological reductionism. That is, everything can be reduced essentially to physics and chemistry, and that's what Richard Dawkins and his friends, for example, believe. Now, I'm very interested in what my colleague has said about cognitive science, because one of the things I do for fun in Oxford, I love to have fun with my colleagues. So I ask them what they do science with, and they always tell me about the latest machine costing $1 billion. And I say, no, I mean this. Oh, you mean my, and they're almost about to say mind when they remember the current theories, and they say brain. Okay, that's okay. You do science with your brain. Tell me about the brain. Well, do you want the long story or the short story? Well, I'll have the short story, please. Well, essentially, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Oh, I see, I said, and you trust it. And you trust it. Tell me, if you thought your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? Who first thought of that? Well, it probably was thought of a long time ago, but Charles Darwin is the most important person who thought of that argument. Goodness, my watch has stopped. How many minutes have I left, sir? 8 minutes, so it didn't quite stop, so there we go. I've started it again. Charles Darwin said, "With me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind?" I want to argue provocatively, ladies and gentlemen, that not only science has not made God irrelevant, but atheism makes science meaningless. And that's a much stronger statement. Let me try and argue that to you. Darwin's doubt persists. John Gray, who's an atheist, professor of the history of European thought, says, "Modern humanism is the faith that through science humankind can know the truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth." And Francis Crick, in a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis, gives us the extreme of reductionism. You, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. But if that was true, we'd never know it. My teacher of quantum physics, John Polkinghorne, points out that this thesis relegates our experiences of beauty, moral obligation, religious encounter to the epiphenomenal scrap heap. It also destroys rationality. Now, two heavyweight philosophers have ploughed in here. One a Christian, one an atheist. The Christian is Alvin Plantinga. If Dawkins is right, he says, that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own science and his atheism. And more interestingly, Thomas Nagel has stirred up cyberspace. If you don't believe me, have a look. He's a brilliant philosopher in New York. In a book called Mind and Cosmos, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of Nature is Almost Certainly False. If ever there was a provocative title of a book, that's it. And he says, look, if the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. So, ladies and gentlemen, my argument is very simple. If you dismiss God and take the atheist picture, it reduces science to meaninglessness. But we don't think it's meaningless. We think it's meaningful. And you need God, as far as I can see, absolutely essentially, as the guarantor of ultimate rationality and meaning, which brings us full circle to the original pioneers of modern science. It's very easy to look back at history and say, well, life began somehow, and it developed somehow, and all this kind of thing. And we've heard much about evolutionary theories. I'm not going to comment on them, because one thing is certain, the origin of life has nothing to do with evolution. Because whatever you think of evolution, it depends on life being there in order to get going. And life itself, we have lived to see, has got descriptors in terms of language. And my final point is the simple one, but I think it's very important, that language is the one area where reductionism fails every time. When you see a word on a screen or written down, you immediately induct upwards to an intelligence that has had an input into that word. However many automatic and natural processes are involved in doing that, words speak of intelligence. And you know of no exceptions to that in every kind of language you may think of, from natural language to computer language. And if we settle on computer language, we have lived to see the greatest irony of the 20th and 21st centuries. Francis Crick and James Watson were motivated by atheism, they explicitly say so, to discover the secret of life and therefore disprove the existence of God. What they discovered as they unraveled brilliantly DNA was that life is based, at least in part, on the longest word that we've ever seen. 3.5 billion letters written in a chemical alphabet. And I'll finish with a little story that illustrates this. In Oxford at dinner, I was sitting beside a biochemist, brilliant man, and he was very disturbed to find I was a pure mathematician. He was even more disturbed to find I believed in God. And he said, we're going to have a miserable dinner because I'm an atheist and I'm a reductionist. So I said, not at all. And we talked about reductionism a bit. So I suggested doing an experiment at the table. And I picked up the menu and it said roast chicken. So he said, what's the problem? That's roast chicken. I said, how do you know? Well, he said, it says so. I said, how do you know? Those are just marks on paper. Oh, no, they're not. He said, they're meaningful. Oh, I said, okay, here's my experiment. Explain to me in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink, the semiotics of those letters, how they carry meaning. And his wife was sitting beside him and she said, get out of that if you can. I tell you that story because he would allow me to tell you that, because he didn't try. He said, you know, for 40 years I've gone into my laboratory thinking it could be done, but it can't. And I nearly said to him, oh, but that would be an intelligence of the gaps. Oh, no. The nature of the situation is that semiotics do not lie within the explanatory power of physics and chemistry. And so postulating an intelligence is the inference to the best explanation. It's not a God of the gap solution at all. It's the most sensible solution we know. Now here's the supreme irony. What Crick and Watson in their atheism have discovered is one of the biggest evidences for an intelligent God behind the universe. The longest word we've ever seen, which resonates brilliantly with that other biblical description of origins. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be that came to be. You realize, of course, that these are existence statements. In the beginning, the Word already was. God, the Word, is eternal. But everything else has come to be. How did it come to be? Through mindless, unguided processes? Of course not. The universe, with its laws, its mathematical describability. One of the major reasons I'm not an atheist is because we can do science. Because science assumes, for its doing, that the universe is rationally intelligible. And the thing that fits with that best is that the universe was caused to be and is held in existence by a rationally intelligent God. Therefore, I think, ladies and gentlemen, that science has not made God irrelevant. But if you go the atheist route, not only is science irrelevant, it is utterly meaningless. Atheism doesn't simply shoot itself in the foot. That's quite painful. It shoots itself in the brain, and that's fatal. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that, John. You had mentioned the Leafs. Whether there's a God or not, they're not going to win the cup. Care how powerful you think God is, he cannot make the Leafs win. Okay, so why is there a nature at all? And I expect a theist to maintain this, right? Why is there something rather than nothing? I'm talking about science, and you're asking a question of metaphysics and of a supernatural nature. Science is not going to go there. If you want to bring something into the realm of science, bring it. You want to bring the Shroud of Turin and claim it was the burial cloth of Jesus? Fine. We'll date it, and we'll show you it wasn't. So when you just say, oh, there had to be something rather than nothing because God willed it to be, okay, then, you know, why, excuse me, why couldn't it be this? A flying spaghetti monster, right? Why does it have to be a God? And then why does it have to be your God? So you seem to be taking too great a leap. You're using abductive reasoning, the power to best explanation. But in my estimation, DNA, I can reason abductively with all of the clues around to indicate that amino acids can gather together and to form RNA first and then DNA second and whatnot. So I have explanations on the side of science for that. Maintain that modern science was driven by Christianity, but it's not because they necessarily wanted to, they pretty much had to. You said Christianity drove science, but where? Where were they driving it? To the corner of torture and death? Because that's what was happening during those time periods. I mean, Galileo, think of what happened to him, not to mention, if you want me to mention him, I will, Giordano Bruno. I mean, here's a guy, in any of our modern estimations, was a decent Christian, and for rewarding him for being such a good Christian, in 1600, the papacy put a metal spike up through his mouth this way and through his mouth this way, stripped him naked, and burned him to death in the town square. Not the most tolerant society pushing science forward. And all he said was, there might be other planets out there that could have other people. Oh yeah? Well, we got something else in mind for you. And it didn't end well for Giordano Bruno, not necessarily too well for Galileo or others who had to keep quiet. And by the way, if Christianity was pushing science, what were they doing for 1,000 years during the Dark Ages? Just thinking about how they're going to push science? No, they don't call it the Dark Ages for nothing. The Enlightenment, the Renaissance, the rebirth, right? So why is there something rather than nothing? Let me think about this. I don't know. But neither do any of you. And on that, we are all equal. We can share in our ignorance together, and we can be humbled by that together. And we can build from the ground up, from the bottom up, and discover fascinating things about this world, ourselves, and this universe. That is where the import of science lies. That is what makes God irrelevant. We don't need any particular God to top down us anymore. We saw what happened during the Dark Ages, during those ages of torture and whatnot. We have been freed from this, and so we can do it ourselves. We don't need any particular supernatural force. Now, in terms of God caused the universe to be, God caused the universe, to me this is an extraordinary leap of faith. Why don't I believe this? Why don't many people here tonight? Shouldn't we all believe this? I mean, if God is the number one, uno, super being in the world, don't you think we should all just be on the same page? Like, wouldn't you think such a powerful being would make itself known extremely well to us? Like maybe show up tonight or something, right? Why is it always like on grilled cheese sandwiches and oil stains and things like that, right? I think I have the right to demand more evidence if you're going to make an extraordinary claim that not only does God exist, but that your very specific notion of God exists. That's an extraordinary claim. You require extraordinary evidence. I have not seen that tonight. Now, John, I would like to believe you. I really would. And I'd like somebody to be able to actually prove to me that God exists. Nobody has been able to do this. Now, I was born and baptized a Catholic. I'm not anymore. My kids, when we raised them, they were given every opportunity to believe in whatever religion they wanted to. At date, I think you're still an atheist. But, I like to be free and to allow them to be able to choose and to think for themselves, rather than to have some imaginary being try to order from the top down what is to be the case. Science has demonstrated to us that we do not need that type of being. Thank you.
Professor Lennox, 5 minutes.
Well, if we're going to go down the torture route, ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you that atheism was largely responsible for over 100 million deaths, not in the first century, but the 20th. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, when he came to America, said, and I found it from so many people because I happen to speak Russian and I've been in Russia many, many times. And they tell me again and again that we thought we could retain a value for human beings and dismiss God. We discovered too late we were wrong. And Solzhenitsyn said, if I am asked to explain the deaths of 100 million of my fellow citizens in a few words, I would say we have forgotten God. Now, there isn't the slightest excuse for the torture of anyone, although Galileo was persecuted not first by the church, incidentally, but by the philosophers, because he was challenging the reigning Aristotelian paradigm. And no historian of science I know today will use him as evidence for the war between science and religion. But the torture route is a very risky one to go down, a very risky one indeed, because the vast rivers of blood that have flowed from Pol Pot, Stalin, and Mao pale the rest of it into insignificance. But of course, we don't argue truth in that kind of way. And Chris said that I made an extraordinary leap to a God. Of course I didn't. All of our experience of life shows when you've got language, you've got mind. I've made the simplest step possible. The step that you make when you go to the beach and you see your name written in the sand, you know one of your kids have been at it. This isn't an extraordinary leap. And then you said, well, it would be wonderful if God showed himself. Well, he has done. Because you see, I'm a Christian, I'm not simply a theist. And of course, if we want more evidence of God, the marvelous thing is, it's not the human search for God, it's God becoming human. And I was interested to hear Chris say that he didn't know what had made the universe, and you don't either. How does he know that you don't know? That is a claim to a great deal of knowledge. I wouldn't claim that you didn't know. Because, of course, I would claim to know at least some of it, because it makes coherent sense and it cogs with reality. Now, of course, he's right when he says that great claims need great evidence. That's why the kind of scientific evidence for me is not adequate. Because God is not a theory, he's a person. And so God, when he came to reveal himself, came in a person of Jesus Christ, whom I believe, even as a scientist, perhaps especially as one, is God incarnate, and you can get to know him. There's a vast distance, of course, between us and God, but God made the distance by coming into our world. And so we can get to know God by giving up our distance and leaving ourselves vulnerable to knowledge. You will never get to know me by putting me in a scanning, tunneling microscope. I have to reveal myself to you. And so my substantive reasons, far bigger than anything I said in the first talk, for believing in God, are that I understand the nature of God from what Christ reveals. And it's testable, as in science, because Christ promises to those who trust him peace, eternal life, forgiveness. I've seen that transform so many lives that its testability for me is beyond question. So I think, sir, the evidence is there. The evidence is there in spades. But why doesn't everybody believe it? Because, ladies and gentlemen, it's not like a proposition of mathematics. We're dealing with relationship with a person. And God is not simply a theory that we can assent to or not. He's a moral being, and this is a moral universe. And so relationship with him raises moral questions. And I have many friends who tell me straight, I don't want there to be a God. I was glad to hear Chris say he does, but that's a very encouraging sign. But moral issues arise. It's not a simple business of X plus Y equals Z, therefore God exists, and you're an idiot if you don't accept it. When Jesus came to earth, performed the most wonderful acts of kindness, healing the sick and all the rest, and people said, go, he went. And that's one of the reasons I'm a Christian, because God loves me enough to respect my intellectual integrity and waits and gives me evidence so that I can respond. If it was overwhelming, there'd be no possibility of love, because love cannot be created by a totalitarian invasion. Thank you.
So what do you want to talk about? Now, We got a few things we can talk about. I don't think it's fair to say atheism is responsible for 1 million deaths. Nobody goes around killing in the name of atheism. I don't believe in God. Die! Nobody does that. We're relatively decent people. And Jeremy, you were with us at dinner tonight, and at lunch we haven't eaten babies in almost 12 hours now. So, we're relatively decent people. So I don't know if you can say atheism is responsible for 100 million deaths.
I'm not saying it. It's the Russians who are saying it themselves, who are steeped in it. And the point is, I take your point. Most of my atheist friends are the most delightful people. In fact, I'd go further than that. I'd say some of them can put me to shame by their moral behavior. So we're one of that. But what I'm saying is, what I have observed and been told by them, is that Marxism, at its heart, had atheism. And the criticism of religion was the very first criticism. And so people do go around in the name of atheism, I'm afraid. That's where the ideology came from. They weren't perhaps saying, of course, I do this in the name of atheism.
Right.
But it's that ideology spawned a culture that was catastrophic in the 20th century. And that's their verdict, and I think they know better than I do.
Yeah, I just can't imagine anybody purposefully going out and saying that they can be justified in killing because they're atheists. I mean, I know we're in a church and all, but let's face it, it's really just the a-holes in life who do that kind of stuff. It doesn't have to do with not believing in a God. They just want something, whether it's material gain or political ideology or whatever it is. But,
so you don't think Nietzsche was right then?
In terms of?
Well, in terms of the fact that he pointed out that when people abolish God, what they don't realize is they cannot in the end retain values, and everything becomes simply a will to power, and it will end in enormous destruction because values will be determined by power.
Why? Is that a necessary thing? That's always going to happen every time we run the film? It's always going to play out the same way?
It's not a question of every time we run the film. We can't predict. We can see what has happened, and the evidence is not strong that atheism had nothing to do with what happened with Stalin, Pol Pot, and the rest of it. All of us are moral beings made in the image of God, whether we believe in them or not.
No, that's a bit of a cop-out. That's a bit of a cop-out.
It's not a cop-out.
Well, sure, because you can't speak for me. You can't really say I'm made in the image of God, and therefore that's what made Jeremy a decent man that he is. In fact, I greatly disbelieve in your particular type of God. I'm speaking
from my worldview.
Well,
and it makes sense.
To you?
No, it makes sense all around the world because...
Not to me, not to him.
Well, half a moment. If you look around, I think we were discussing this at dinner actually, it is the observable fact that in every culture we'll find the golden rule, including humanism and Roman pagan religion and so on.
For sure.
And people raise the question, why is that so? Well, I'm saying a reasonably plausible explanation is that everybody, whether they believe in God or not, is a moral being. So we've got an innate conscience. It's hardwired.
And that came from God?
Yes, originally creating us.
Yeah, but it's not a proof insofar as it has any ability to convince me or to persuade me.
Well, what would persuade you, Chris? I mean,
well, if we're talking about science, the reason why science makes God irrelevant is because it's very good at explaining cause and effects. We don't need any gods anymore to explain the world. So I guess if you could show me how your God injects itself into the current scientific understanding of the world, then I would have to believe you, wouldn't I? Like, I have to go where the evidence leads me.
Well, I don't think your cause and effect in science explains the origin of life, the origin of consciousness, and the existence of the whole universe.
Well, I think I've done a relatively decent job at trying to figure out, at least postulate on the origins of consciousness with our particular species. I published quite a bit on this, and that's basically what I was doing at Harvard, was trying to figure out how that came to be. That's what I was talking about tonight. No, it just seems to me that science is so efficient at explaining how we came to be the way we are, and that your ideas I find interesting, though quaint and antiquated. I understand why religions are important to people. I get that. I get the emotional attachment, and I do understand that they give your life meaning and purpose. But here's something I'd like everyone to know, including yourself. What would the difference be in your lives right now and for the rest of your lives if the God that John believes in didn't exist? Would you still care for each other? Would you still get along? would you still be in awe of the universe and all of us? Okay?
No,
So
you
that's
wouldn't.
how I live my life. I don't have John's particular belief or concept of his God, but I can still enjoy life, believe in things, and get along with my neighbor, and you and I share common values.
But you're forgetting something.
What's that?
If the God I believe in didn't exist, neither would you.
Well, see,
There'll
that's
be
again
no-
just a cop-out. No, because then I just get to say, no, John. I then just get to say, well, if the flying spaghetti monster didn't exist and touch you with his noodly appendage, you wouldn't have existed.
And to compare the flying spaghetti monster with God is ludicrous.
Why?
Well, the flying spaghetti monster has inspired no science that I know of. It has created no universes I know of. It doesn't.
Same with your God.
It doesn't look remotely intelligent, and
But how can you tell that?
well, if you
How
can't
can you
tell
tell
it,
that?
I don't know that the
But
conversation.
here's the interesting thing. This actually exists.
Yes, it does.
I can't see your God. Why?
Oh,
Why?
come on.
I would like to see your God. If he could make himself, or it, or she, or whatever, could make itself, its presence known right
But
here,
God
right
has,
now.
God has done that, and you can't see gravity.
He's done it. When?
You can't.
When?
Just a moment. You said you can't see. Do you only believe what you can see? Can you see gravity?
I can infer from gravity.
But then you've given it away. Because, of course, that's
I'm giving
exactly
it
my
away.
position. Yes, you are.
What am I giving away?
Because you're moving from the results of visual perception to inference.
As we all must do to survive
Yes,
and reproduce.
and once we open it up to inference, of course, my arguments tonight have been inferring the existence of God from what we see around us. I've not heard any arguments, really, that would begin to convince me of atheism
Why do
from what
my
you said
arguments
tonight.
infer that there is no God? Where is your reality measuring stick? You show me that you can measure reality, and then show me with 100% accuracy on your reality measuring stick that you're God, and it is only your particular brand of God, not Vishnu, not Quetzalcoatl, none of those, just your particular brand, then I would have to believe you. But you don't have a reality measuring stick. None of us do.
Well, then
That's
why-
why we are ignorant. This is what the ancient skeptics told us to do. Be humble in your ignorance.
Okay, so do you think your talk was a parade of ignorance?
I think it was made in light of the fact that I am humble enough to recognize that I don't know a lot.
No, I don't either. But you
Good,
see,
we can
the
agree
fact-
on that.
the
That's
fact
good.
that
Let's
we're-
keep it at that.
Yes, but the fact that we're having a rational discussion assumes that we believe in some sort of objectivity, however we define it, that's common to us both. And my argument was that that rationality is dependent on God.
That's
if
a
you
leap. You haven't shown me that step.
Yes, but
then it's dependent on this.
well,
Right,
what
I
do
get
you
to say
make
anything
of
then.
Nagel's argument? I mean, he sits on your side of the fence as an atheist, and he's pointing out that this kind of naturalistic argument, which reduces things to physics and chemistry, blows itself out of the water. How do you respond to that?
I think he's wrong.
Why?
Because what we can observe and what we can understand is the best we can do at any given time. This is what I talked about in terms of
Yeah.
facticity. We can only do so well given the logic, the math, the science, all of that that we have at any given time.
Well, what's wrong with his logic then?
With Nagel's logic?
Yes.
The
And
fact
what
that
I said earlier, what's wrong with it? What's the fundamental problem?
he hasn't demonstrated that there is anything over and above material reality. He hasn't shown that there's a metaphysical
But
aspect.
half a minute. Nagel is not a theist. He ought to be. But
What is
he's
he, a
not.
deist?
No, he's not. He still says he's an atheist. He still thinks that there must be a naturalistic way out, but he's got trapped because he's coming into the information trap, and information is not material. And to my mind, as a scientist, that's the end of materialism as a philosophy.
I think there's some equivocation, a fallacy being committed there. If they're referring to the immaterial, like thoughts are immaterial and numbers are immaterial, that kind of thing, that is quite distinct from a superior intelligent being. I don't necessarily see the connection between those types of immateriality and needing or having a transcendent God necessary in order for there to be material. I don't get that. To me, again, that requires quite a leap of faith. But be that as it may, you believe in the Trinity?
Oh, yes.
In the Trinity.
Yes, I do. I believe that God is fairly complex.
So you got Christ, the incarnation of God,
Yes.
the human incarnation of
Well, let
God.
me
You got
give
the
you a-
Word, which is the Father, and
Yes.
then what's the Holy
Let
Spirit?
me give you a simple illustration of it. Like you, I'm married. I have a wife. And we are, two of us, one flesh. They're a fellowship with two persons in it, two personalities. Now, God has revealed himself to us in terms of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You ask me, do I understand that completely? Of course not.
How did he reveal himself?
Sorry?
The Trinity revealed itself to your wife and you. How?
Oh, no, what I'm drawing an analogy. At the human level, she and I are a fellowship of two persons in one unit. God is a fellowship of three persons in one unit. And that makes sense.
That's a legal contract, and you're talking kind of poetry now, right? Like it's just kind of like we're a union of fellowship.
Be careful, because we use metaphors when we're talking about reality. C.S. Lewis has pointed out frequently that the mistake we make is, and we do it in physics and everywhere else, we use metaphors to describe reality. If I say my heart is broken, it doesn't mean the pump needs fixing, but it means I'm in real pain. The metaphor stands for reality.
Right. Okay, the way I see things, I define myself as an agtheist.
A what?
You heard right. An agtheist. So I'm an atheist to all world religions. They're all wrong. I don't think any one of them's gotten it right. But I'm an agnostic insofar, and only insofar, as whether or not what we are experiencing, what you call something rather than nothing, was intended or not.
Okay.
And to that, we could, you know what a disjunct is, either or.
I think so.
Either the universe was intended to be, or it was not.
What's your suspicion at the moment?
Well, as a skeptic, right, as a Pyrrhonian, I don't know. I really don't know.
Wait a minute. A skeptic is not somebody who doesn't know. He's someone who checks something out as a distance. An agnostic is somebody who doesn't know.
No,
so which are you?
A true Pyrrhonian skeptic would look at that disjunct and say, I can't answer either way. I don't have overwhelming evidence to answer with certainty either way. So I have to remain agnostic on that position, suspend judgment, and set it off to the side. What a person then sometimes does, like yourself, is that they choose the one part of the disjunct that says the universe was intended. And then you don't stop there. You go about adding conjuncts and strings of conjuncts. And the God created all stuff on 6 days, rested on the seventh, played around with some people, made him out of dirt and whatnot. They screwed up. Now he's got to make part of himself human to die because of his original screw up, and then they're going to be free to go to a place called heaven where they, do this and do that. So you're adding strings of huge numbers of conjuncts where the likelihood of inconsistencies and contradictions goes way up. Whereas I just stay back with the original disjunct and say, I don't know.
The way to discuss literature seriously is not to parody it, which you've just done with Genesis.
How so?
Because I happen to take it very seriously.
Genesis.
And the idea of God screwing up and making people out of the dust of the earth. Parody won't answer anything, and that's a bit unfortunate to do that, because once you begin to take Genesis seriously, then it's a very different story. And one begins to see it's a glorious story. Because what it tells us, just looking at it, is the very interesting fact that God did not create everything at once. There was a sequence, and God said, and God said, and God said. That is, this universe is not a closed system of cause and effect, as you maintain. It's an open system. And at certain intervals, God injected new energy and information into the system. That seems to me to accord much better with what we know of the history of the universe than a naturalistic explanation. But the thrilling thing about it, let's enjoy a bit of it.
Okay.
The thrilling thing about it is that the sequence of steps stops with human beings. Made in the image of God, ladies and gentlemen. If that's true, that is giving us a dignity that you'll get nowhere else. And so the question of evidence that it's true becomes of enormous importance. And I only believe it because I think there's evidence for it. But as I said earlier, I do believe it's testable.
And I haven't seen any evidence, but...
You haven't seen any?
No. And if you believe God made us...
Have you ever seen a person's life transformed by Christianity, Chris? They come to a living faith. I don't mean religiosity, going to church.
Right. No, I know what you mean.
Have you ever seen that?
They're usually in prison. God looks like a nice safety net, so you have him. Now here's something I want to find out
Oh,
from you.
dear, that's
Do you believe-
simplistic Freudianism.
Sorry, tell me about your mother. So,
I would be delighted to.
do you believe
Because
that...
you see, my parents, I'll just tell you, and answer
Let me
your
guess,
question.
they were Christian.
Yes, but they allowed me to think.
So did
and
mine.
they were not sectarian.
I'd like to get back to your notion of God and how you define God. Do you define him in the kind of the classic way of being like all-knowing and all-powerful and that sort of thing?
I'm wary about definitions that are not biblical. But having studied the Bible all of my life, I'm a bit leery of philosophical generalizations that sometimes lend themselves much more easily to falsification.
And do you believe in the literal truth of the Bible?
Do you? Of course I don't. Jesus said, I am the door. I honestly didn't expect to be asked that question by a philosopher. The point is, nobody takes the Bible literally, but they take it seriously. What they mean when they say they take it literally is the sense in which the reformers defined literally coming from Latin. They did not mean the baseline level of literalistic. And they explained it in their commentaries that to take it literally means to take it at its base level. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You're talking about the physical universe. It's not a metaphor. You know that by asking, what is it a metaphor for? It's a metaphor for itself, so it's baseline literal. But if that doesn't work, you go to the next level up. Jesus said, I am the door. Well, he didn't mean he was made of wood. How do we know that? Because we know something about the natural world. But he meant he was a real door. He was a real doorway into a genuine spiritual experience of God, which we can have by trusting him. It was real, but it's not literal as base level. It's literal as a spiritual experience. I find some people are very nervous. They feel defensive as Christians, and I understand them. And what I want to do is to help them to see that they shouldn't be afraid of the word literal, but they shouldn't use it because it is misleading. You know, Israel was a land flowing with milk and honey.
So how do we know which parts of the Bible?
Well, how do you know to understand this statement? Israel was a land flowing with milk and honey. You can understand exactly what that means. But examine it. Israel was a land, that's literal. The milk and honey were literal. Flowing is a metaphor. It's not saying that when the Israelites came to the land, a great sticky bowl of milk and honey came hurtling down the main street. And you can tell that as easily as I can.
Okay.
In your study of literature...
So milk and honey's one thing. What about homosexuality as an abomination? How do we interpret that one?
You're raising a different topic totally that
I'm
requires
just referring to a book that you are claiming as evidence for God as saying certain things that you should and should not do.
Hi, sorry to interrupt this very spirited discussion, but I don't think we want to stay here all night. Just thank you to both discussants. So I'm going to ask each of our speakers to read the question that they'd like to answer and then answer it, and then we'll go back and forth. I think we'll allow 1 to 2 minutes maximum for each question. We'll start with Professor DiCarlo.
Oh, thank you. How many questions? Okay. This one's kind of long, but it's a good one. To Dr. DiCarlo, one area where it is believed that science cannot answer and the supernatural is necessary is the area of ethics. Some new atheists, such as Sam Harris, believe that we can make value judgments based on scientific observation, while others, such as Michael Roos, believe that such judgments are purely subjective and relative. Do you believe that ethics can be made into a branch of science? Why or why not? Good question, interesting. Michael Roos was my supervisor for my PhD, by the way, yeah. And Sam Harris stole most of my ideas. Now, I'm just kidding. But this is interesting. It says the supernatural is necessary in the area of ethics. Is it? I don't see why it should be necessary. I don't need any appeal to a God. I don't know the absoluteness, the certainty of my actions or the actions of others. I really don't. For all I know, this universe is entirely meaningless. It has no purpose. It has no goal. It is de trop, without rhyme or reason, for all I know. So I don't know if there's any supernatural attachment to ethics. One of the things I'm familiar with is pain and discomfort. And since I can feel pain and discomfort, then I can project that onto others and try to empathize and understand what their pain and comfort might be. And then try to act in ways to alleviate pain and discomfort where possible. So I can be highly tolerant. As John and I were discussing at dinner, I'm not totally against religious belief. I don't care what a person's religious convictions are. I really don't. It doesn't bother me in the least. As long as a person's ideas are causing very, very little harm, then my tolerance is very, very high. But once a person's beliefs start to generate harm, then the level of tolerance starts to dip until there's an intersection point. But that's my perceived concept of what harm is. Ultimately, I have no idea what value actually is. Proximally, that is to say, within a given situation, I can put forward ideas. Now, if there's any objective morality that I can think of, personally, I think we're basically biological robots. But the fact of the matter is that we have the capacity to see the machinery inside the robots, and then to try to figure out, are those machines acting in accordance to these values we arbitrarily decided are good and bad? And if so, fine, then the machine's okay. Then tolerance is up here and harm is down here. So, thank you.
Professor Lennox. You have 2 minutes for your question, so go ahead and read your question.
You're not responding to this.
No, you're
Very
reading
good.
your question.
Yes. If God created everything, what or who created God? Now, this is Dawkins, of course. Yes, and it really is, well, let's analyze it logically if it's not too late at night. Who or what created X? What's the assumption hidden in the question? It's that X was created, of course. So if you say who or what created God, you're assuming God is created. But what if God isn't created? The question doesn't apply. End of story. You see, it claims to be, and Dawkins, I was amazed. I used to get this question a lot in Russia, but I never thought I'd get it in Oxford. I never thought it would form the heart of the God delusion, or one of the hearts of the God delusion. You see, created gods are obviously a delusion, and we don't need Dawkins or anybody else to tell us that. They're idols. But you see, the interesting thing is, this question does not apply by definition to the God of the Bible, who is eternal and not created. But since it applies to created gods, I thought I would turn it on Richard Dawkins. And I said, you think this is a valid question, okay. You believe the universe created you. Who created your creator? I've waited 8 years for the answer to that question. You see, what the question is really about philosophically is ultimate reality. Who created the creator that created the creator, and so on. But the sequence doesn't go back infinitely, either on the God side or the atheist side. Most of my atheist friends have an ultimate reality. It's either the multiverse, mass, energy, or these days, nothing. And the ultimate reality on my side is God. So I think the question actually isn't a defeater for the biblical God. It's a defeater for created gods, but we knew it anyway.
Thank you. Professor DiCarlo.
It's a short one. My answer will be short. Can you provide positive evidence that God doesn't exist? Yeah, nobody can. That's known as argumentum ad ignorantium. It's kind of a trick question. So, I don't have any evidence for. You have to keep the onus of burden of proof on the person who makes the claim. So if you claim there's a God, you bring it. You have to show me the money, okay? So since I don't make any claims of any such God, I don't have to prove a thing.
Thank you. Professor Lennox.
Don't the biblical miracles violate the laws of nature? No. I think you want more of an answer than that, don't you? Do you? Oh, yes. Well, okay. This is one of those statements that goes back in a way to David Hume, but it's older than him. And it's the reason why many of my scientific colleagues are just unprepared to examine, say, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, which lies at the heart of Christianity, because they say, look, miracles violate the laws of nature, so there's no point in you talking to me about a specific miracle because none can occur. Well, I think Hume was wrong. And I'll explain why. I had the opportunity before he died to chat to Anthony Flew, who was the greatest interpreter of Hume and was a strong atheist in his day until, much to the chagrin of the new atheists in high old age, he came to believe in a deistic God because of the structure of DNA, its linguistic structure, which is interesting. And I said to him, what about David Hume and miracles? He said, well, no. He said, I'm sorry, I was wrong about Hume. And he said, all my books about Hume would have to be rewritten, and sadly, I'll never live to do it. What honesty in a high-powered philosopher. It was quite moving, actually. Now, this is a big subject, and I've actually decided to write a chapter on the resurrection in my last book on this through the eyes of David Hume. But a simple, just bottom-line approach to it is this. It rests on a confusion of the meaning of the word law. I'm staying in a hotel in Toronto. I put $100 in my drawer last night. I put another 100 in the drawer tonight. And tomorrow morning I wake up and I find $50. What's been broken, the laws of arithmetic or the laws of Canada? Now you're laughing because you immediately see that the two kinds of laws are different. Now, assuming that the laws of Canada have been broken and it's not my wife looking for shopping money, what tells you that the laws of Canada have been broken? Your knowledge that the laws of arithmetic have not been. It's not 100 plus 100 was 200 yesterday, it's 50 today. How very interesting. You thought that the drawer was a closed system of cause and effect. You discovered, to your horror, it wasn't. Somebody put their hand in. That's because you know the law of arithmetic, and it's exactly the same. David Hume was rather foolish when he suggested that the people of New Testament days were credulous, pre-scientific, they didn't know the laws of nature, and so they were prepared to believe in miracles. That is sheer nonsense to the fact. When Joseph discovered his fiancée Mary was pregnant, he wanted to divorce her not because he didn't know where babies came from, but because he did. He knew exactly where they came from, as much as any modern gynecologist. And it took enormous pressure, supernatural revelation from God, for him to accept his wife. And it's obvious, isn't it? If you don't know that dead bodies normally remain dead, you wouldn't be surprised at a resurrection. So, in understanding miracle, we have to understand that the universe is created by God with built-in regularities. Otherwise, we'd never recognize when God did something special. He's responsible for the regularities. He's responsible for doing the special things. The laws of nature are not like the laws of the land. They're not constraining him. Let me finally say, if I was saying that Jesus rose from the dead by natural processes going on in the grave before it happened, then it would be breaking the laws of nature. But nobody claims that. I'm claiming that the power of God from outside was inputted and God raised him from the dead. Science can say nothing about that. So miracles do not violate the laws of nature, in spite of what David Hume and so many other people say.
Thank you. So just for the sake of fairness, because Professor DiCarlo gave a very brief answer and you gave a rather extended one, we're going to have time for one more question from Dr. DiCarlo, and then we'll have closing statements.
Okay. This one, I think, John, is for you. But I'll go with this one. With evolved morality, is the best we can hope for relative preferences? If so, on what basis do we hold others accountable? Is there a basis for objective morality? You gotta be careful with that term, objective. We can come to some type of universal agreement, but objective morality insofar as when I release the flying spaghetti monster from my fingers and it falls downwards, and we have a sense of objectivity in that, insofar as everybody in here will agree that when I open my fingers it will fall downwards. Are we going to have a morality like that? I'm not sure. Are there actions that everybody could agree are always right or always wrong? This is one of the questions I talk to my students about. Is there any particular action you can think of that could always be justifiable or always be condemned, given the context of a certain type of situation? That I have no idea. What I think we can strive for is to use science and to better understand what makes us tick. For example, you have this gentleman on the prairies, Vincent Lee, who decapitated and ate part of a human being. And he was not sentenced to any prison term. He was a schizophrenic who was off of his meds. We have found the cause of his behavior through science. We have figured out why he behaved in such a horrific manner. We do not like it. Why? Because it causes pain, discomfort, and injury to us and to those we care about deeply. No God needed here. Just basic humanity caring about other humans. And while we're on that topic, we can extend that to other species as well. We're not the only ones here, by the way. So, in terms of morality, to me it just comes down to the idea of having the capacity for empathy. But if I have a mental disorder or a grapefruit-sized tumor inside of my brain, and I'm incapable of acting according to a particular moral code, how accountable am I to be held for my actions? It's Clockwork Orange time, folks. We have to figure out and use science, not religion, not blind faith, what makes people tick. Then we can truly help people. That's how we become compassionate. We figure out what makes people tick, and we figure out how we're going to help them to get along to the types of rules and laws we develop for ourselves from the bottom up. Thank you.
And so now I'm going to ask for closing statements, 3 minutes from Professor Lennox and then 3 minutes from Professor DiCarlo.
Better get my timer working. Just give me 1 second, there we go. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this evening as much as I have. And part of that enjoyment and value is having a colleague like Professor DiCarlo to discuss with me in such a friendly and respectful fashion, which I have much appreciated. You and the audience, it's up to you to judge what makes most sense. And one of the interesting and valuable things about evenings like this is that they're not the end of the story. You can now go and, I hope, enriched in various directions, can ask yourself the question about your own worldview. Does it make sense of what you discover around you in the universe and in your own experience? And the wonderful thing is, at least so far in our society, we have that freedom to make those personal judgments. So if you're an atheist, do get to know some Christians. Find out what makes them tick. And if you're a Christian, get to know some atheists and agnostics and skeptics and ask them questions. Because one of the best ways forward is a matter of constant engagement and really listening and remembering that you've one mouth and two ears, so you should listen and speak in proportion to that. My final point is that the bottom line for me in all of this, ladies and gentlemen, is a problem we haven't faced tonight. It was on the question I was about to try to answer, and it's the problem of suffering and evil and ultimate justice. One of my biggest reasons for not being an atheist is it is hopeless. We strive for justice in this world rightly, but of course if death is the end, There is no ultimate justice, and the vast multi-millions of people who have ever lived will never get justice, either in this world or the world to come. Christianity, I believe, has a unique way into understanding that. Central to its message is the cross of Jesus Christ. And if that means anything at all, if Jesus Christ is God, it means that God has not remained distant from our suffering, but has become part of it. That's a way in. But if that were the end of it, we'd never have known anything more. But because he rose from the dead, the early Christian apostles went out into the world and said, there is to be a final judgment. There is to be a fair judgment and a rational judgment, which immediately gives validity to your conscience, which talks about justice. Atheism knows nothing of that. And the genius of it all is, when the matter of justice and judgment is raised, sometimes we fear it. Because we ourselves are marked with the evil we see in others. The only solution I know, ladies and gentlemen, is the marvelous thing that Jesus Christ died on that cross and took my sin and judgment. And so, because he rose from the dead, I can know in this life the certainty of peace with God and forgiveness. Christianity competes with no other religion or philosophy, of course, because none of them offer us anything like this. Thank you very much.
Professor DiCarlo.
Well, thank you very much for allowing for this dialogue and debate. Can you give me 3 minutes on your thing? I'm kidding. No, it's okay. It's okay. Don't worry about it. It's okay. No, I was very happy to have this discussion here tonight. Interesting that John mentioned that the notion of justice, that if God doesn't exist, then nobody can be held accountable for what they do and whatnot. You have to ask yourself this, right? You have to think about this very carefully. You have brains. You have minds. You have the capacity to think for yourselves. And you can ask yourself, why? Why is justice so important? Millions of people have died on this planet and will continue to die on this planet, as will all of us at some point, and the majority of whom have been forgotten forever. And if that's just the way life is, then so be it. Doesn't that then make this life all the more valuable, all the more interesting, all the more important to us to get along with each other and figure out how we can all do the stuff we want to do, whether it's atheists or agnostics or Christians or Jews or Muslims or Hindus? None of that matters, because we know in our hearts this could be it. An atheist has the ability to look into that abyss and realize this could be it. That's not an easy thing to do. And I understand if some of you are religious minded because you like the idea of community, you like the idea of getting together with other like-minded individuals. Well, we do that too. We do that with the Society of Ontario Free Thinkers. We do that with Humanist Canada and other organizations. So we get that sense of community. We are like-minded people. But we will, as John mentioned, have open debates and discussions with those whose opinions and values differ from ours, because that's what intelligent communities do. And that's how we understand and foster the concept of tolerance and equality, irrespective of what our belief systems are. And on that note, I'd like to thank the organizers, I'd like to thank Nick, and I'd like to thank the Power to Change people and all of you for welcoming us here into this debate tonight. Thank you very much.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.